Sweetwater Regional Medical Center delivered 340 babies last year and won the Texas Rural Hospital Excellence Award. It also killed 7 patients and buried every record that proved it. A 28-year-old teacher went in for a routine appendectomy on a Tuesday morning. She never left the operating room. And the man who ran that hospital, Warren Graff, stood at her memorial service and told her family how devastated the staff was. What her family didn't know was that the surgeon who killed her had killed before, and Warren Graff had been covering for him for 4 years. 3 months after she died, I walked into the Texas State Medical Board office in Austin with a spiral notebook and a box of original surgical logs that Warren Graff thought he'd destroyed. The investigator opened that box, pulled out the first file, and her hands went still. Now, if this story is going to make sense, I need you to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Because what Warren Graff did to protect that surgeon, and what he did to try to stop me, you're not going to believe it until you hear every piece. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. I want to know who's here for this one. My name is Elias Toomey. I'm 47 years old, and I mopped the floors of that hospital for 19 years. I knew every hallway, every supply closet, every squeaky wheel on every gurney in that place. I knew which light in the east corridor flickered at 2 a.m. I knew which stairwell door didn't latch. I knew the smell of the surgical wing at shift change, bleach and cold metal, and something underneath that you stop noticing after your first year. Sweetwater's a small town, maybe 10,000 people if you count the outskirts. 1 hospital, 1 Walmart, a Dairy Queen that's been there since 1978. The kind of place where you wave at people in the H-E-B parking lot, and you mean it. I'd lived there my whole adult life. My ex-wife still lives on Cedar Street. My daughter graduated from Sweetwater High in 2016. The teacher's name was Marisol Becerra. She taught 3rd grade at Southeast Elementary. She'd moved to Sweetwater from El Paso 3 years before she died. Young, bright, the kind of teacher who stayed late making dioramas with her students. People in town talked about her the way they talk about someone who chose to be there. Not stuck, chosen. I didn't know Marisol well, but I knew her face from the hallways when she'd bring a kid in for a broken wrist or a bad cough. She had this calm about her. Even in the ER waiting room, she'd sit there reading to whatever kid she'd brought in, and the whole room got quieter. The hospital was a good place to work, or I thought it was. Warren Graff had been administrator for 11 years by then. Tall guy, silver hair, always in a pressed shirt. The kind of man who remembered your kid's name and asked about your back pain. People liked him. I liked him. He had a way of talking to you that made you feel included, even when he was telling you nothing. Long sentences, warm voice, a hand on your shoulder that stayed a beat too long. And the surgeon, Dr. Nils Fenton, he'd come on staff in 2015. General surgery. Recruited from a hospital in Lubbock. People were excited. Sweetwater Regional didn't usually attract surgeons with Fenton's credentials. He was supposed to be a get. I remember thinking, when Fenton arrived, that things were looking up. New equipment in the surgical wing, a new recovery ward. Warren was always talking about the future of rural healthcare. It felt real. But by March 2017, something was off. I couldn't have told you what exactly. Small things. A records clerk who wouldn't meet my eyes. A surgical schedule that changed without explanation. The feeling you get when the air pressure drops before a storm and nobody's said the word yet. The first time I noticed something wrong was a Wednesday night. I was restocking the surgical wing supply room, gauze, IV bags, the usual, and I heard shouting from OR2. Not loud, but sharp, clipped. The kind of voice you use when you're giving an order, not having a conversation. I stopped. The door was closed, but the walls in that wing are thin. I heard Fenton's voice, clear as day, say, Get her out of here before someone sees this. I didn't know what he meant. I finished restocking. The next morning, I checked the surgical log for OR2. There was nothing scheduled for the night before. No patient, no procedure, no entry. I asked one of the nurses, just casually over coffee in the break room, if anything had happened in OR2. She looked at me funny and said, "No. Why?" That was the first time. I told myself I'd misheard. Maybe it was a TV somewhere. Maybe I was tired. Then, in June, a 61-year-old retired oil field worker went in for a hernia repair. Fenton operated. The man died in recovery. Cardiac arrest, the report said. His wife was told it was a complication of anesthesia. I was on shift that night. I'd helped move him from the OR to recovery. I'd told him to take it easy, that I'd check on him in a bit. He'd squeezed my arm and said, "Appreciate it, son." An hour later, I came back and the crash cart was out. But the code team didn't look panicked. They looked resigned. One of the nurses, a woman I'd worked with for years, was standing in the hallway with her arms crossed. She wouldn't look at me. I said, "What happened?" She said, "He didn't make it." I said, "How?" And she walked away. The next morning, there was a staff meeting in the second-floor conference room. Graf ran it himself. He talked about the loss. He used the phrase, "the reality of rural medicine," 3 times. He said these outcomes were heartbreaking but statistically inevitable in a facility that served an aging population with limited specialist access. He smiled while he said it, that same practiced warmth. And then he said, "The best thing we can do for this family, and for ourselves, is to let the process work, and not burden them with questions they aren't equipped to answer." I sat in the back of that meeting and felt something turn over in my stomach. He'd made the family sound like the problem. The man who died on that table was a human being who squeezed my arm and called me son, and Graf was talking about him like a line item. That bothered me. Not just the death. People die in hospitals. I've seen it hundreds of times. What bothered me was the way everyone acted afterward. Quiet. Not sad quiet. Careful quiet. Everyone picking their words one at a time. I went to the records office 3 days later. I wanted to see the surgical report. The clerk, a young woman, couldn't have been more than 25, told me the file had been pulled for administrative review. I asked when it would be back. She said, "I don't know. Mr. Graf has it." That was the second thing, but I still wasn't connecting anything yet. I just thought it was strange. The third thing happened in October. A 43-year-old woman came in for gallbladder removal. Fenton operated. She developed a post-operative infection that turned septic. She was transferred to Abilene and died 8 days later. I was there when they loaded her into the ambulance. She was gray. I don't mean pale, I mean gray, the color of wet cement. And one of the paramedics, a guy I'd known for 10 years, looked at me while they were closing the doors and said, "This is the third one, Elias." I said, "Third what?" He said, "Third one from that surgeon who didn't have to go like this." And then he got in the ambulance and left. I called the county records office that week. I wanted to see if any complaints had been filed about Fenton. The clerk said the files had been transferred to the hospital's legal department in 2016. Transferred where, exactly? She didn't know. Nobody knew. I drove home with the radio off, just listening to the tires on the road. I started paying attention after that. Not investigating, just watching, keeping my eyes open. And what I saw scared me. Between October 2017 and February 2018, Fenton performed 41 surgeries at Sweetwater Regional. 3 of those patients developed serious complications. One, a 56-year-old rancher, died. Heart failure, the report said. 3 days post-op. I know this because I started writing things down. I had this spiral notebook, pocket-sized, green cover, the kind you buy at the dollar store. I kept it in my truck. Every time I heard about a complication or a death on Fenton's table, I wrote down the date, the room number, the time, and whatever I could find out about the patient. I didn't know why I was doing it, honestly. I just needed to put it somewhere, because nobody was talking about it. Not the nurses, not the other doctors, not anyone.
One afternoon, I saw Fenton and the chief of surgery standing by the vending machines near radiology. She was signing something on a clipboard, and she looked uncomfortable. Jaw tight, pen moving fast, not reading what she was signing. Fenton stood too close. She stepped back when she finished and walked away without a word. I filed that in the back of my head.
The one person who did try to say something was a nurse named Corinne Vasquez. She'd been in the ER for 6 years. Good nurse, direct, no hedging, no softening. She said what she meant in as few words as possible. She filed an internal incident report in January 2018 about Fenton's complication rate. She cited 3 specific cases. 2 weeks later, Corinne was terminated. The official reason was repeated violations of patient confidentiality protocols. I saw her cleaning out her locker. She had this look on her face, not angry, empty. I remembered her 6 months earlier in the break room on a slow night, laughing at something on her phone and sliding it across the table to show me. A video of her nephew trying to eat a lemon. She'd been loud that night, full. Now she was folding scrubs into a bag and she looked like someone had turned the volume off. I said, "Corinne, what happened?" She said, "I told the truth, Elias. That's what happened." She moved to San Angelo after that. I didn't see her again for 3 years. Here's the part that kept me up at night. I started looking at Fenton's surgical schedule more carefully, and I noticed something. Every time a patient died or had a serious complication, the surgical log for that procedure would disappear from the records room within 48 hours. Every time. It would get pulled for administrative review, and it would never come back. I asked the records clerk about it once. She got nervous. She said, "Mr. Graff handles all surgical reviews personally." Warren Graff, the administrator, the man who shook hands with families at the memorial services. I want to pause here for a second. Have you ever worked somewhere and realized, slowly, over months, that the place you trusted was lying to you? Not about something small, about something that mattered, about people's lives? I'd love to hear your story in the comments, because that feeling, that slow realization, it doesn't hit you all at once. It drips, and by the time you know for certain, you've already been carrying it for months. But I need to tell you about what happened in March of 2018, because that's when I found out exactly what Warren Graff was hiding and why he couldn't afford to let anyone find it. I was cleaning the administrative offices on a Saturday. Weekend shifts were quiet. Most of the front office was empty. I was vacuuming Graff's outer office when I noticed his door was slightly open. He was supposed to be at a conference in Dallas. I wasn't planning to go in. I'd cleaned that office hundreds of times, and the door was always locked on weekends. Always. But that Saturday, it wasn't. The latch hadn't caught, and the desk light was on. The little brass lamp he kept by his monitor. I pushed the door open with my elbow. I told myself I was just going to turn off the light, save the hospital a few cents on the electric bill. That's what I told myself. On his desk, under a glass paperweight shaped like the state of Texas, was a framed photograph I'd never seen before. Graff kept that desk clean. Nothing personal, just the lamp and a pen holder and whatever files he was working on. But this photo was sitting out, right next to the keyboard. It was a wedding photo. Warren Graff standing next to a woman I recognized as his wife, and next to her as the best man was Nils Fenton. I picked it up. On the back, handwritten, Warren and Catherine Graff, Nils and Diane Fenton, August 12, 2006. Diane, Fenton's wife, Catherine's sister. Nils Fenton was Warren Graff's brother-in-law. I put the photo back. My hands were steady. That's the part that scared me. How calm I was. I think my body had already figured it out weeks ago. My brain just needed the picture to catch up. I drove home that night and sat in my truck in the driveway for 40 minutes. I had the notebook in the glove compartment. 5 names, 5 deaths, all Fenton's patients. All records pulled by Warren Graff. His brother-in-law's surgical disasters, cleaned up and filed away one after another. And now I knew why. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I called in sick on Monday. I just sat in my kitchen staring at that notebook, running my thumb along the edges of the pages.
I could feel the dents where I'd pressed the pen too hard. Every entry, a person. Every person, gone. Because here's the thing, I was an orderly. I mopped floors and restocked supply closets. I didn't have a law degree. I didn't have a journalism career. I had a GED and 19 years pushing gurneys. Who was going to listen to me?
It took me 2 more weeks to decide. And what I decided at first was to do nothing. I know how that sounds, but you have to understand. This was my job, my health insurance. My daughter's college was paid through a tuition benefit the hospital offered employees with 15 or more years of service. If I made noise and I was wrong, or if I was right and nobody cared, I'd lose everything. So I went back to work. I closed the notebook. I put it in the glove compartment and I shut the glove compartment, and I sat there with my hands on the steering wheel for a long time before I turned the key. And I kept writing in the notebook. Even after I decided to do nothing, I kept writing. I couldn't stop. April 2018 through the end of that year was, I don't know how to describe it, normal on the surface and rotten underneath. Walking on a floor you know is going to give out. Fenton kept operating. 2 more patients had serious complications between April and August. One died, a 67-year-old woman named Rita. Pneumonia following a bowel resection. The family didn't question it. She had other health problems. It looked natural. But I was watching now. I saw the chart get pulled. I saw Graf's secretary carry the file to his office. Same pattern, same 48-hour window. 1 week after Rita died, a newer nurse on the surgical floor, young, maybe 2 years in, came into the break room looking rattled. She sat down and said to nobody in particular, "Does anyone else think Dr. Fenton's complication numbers are high? I've never seen this rate at my last facility." The break room went quiet. Nobody answered her. She looked around, picked up her coffee, and left. The following Monday, I checked the schedule. She'd been reassigned to outpatient intake, away from surgical. 6 patients dead in 4 years, all Fenton's table. All records handled personally by Warren Graf, and anyone who noticed got moved or fired. I want to be honest about something. During this time, I started thinking maybe I was the one who was wrong. Maybe complication rates like this were normal for a rural hospital. Maybe I was seeing a pattern that wasn't there. I almost convinced myself. Then I met Tomas Becerra. It was September 2018. I was at the Valero station on Lamar filling up my truck when a guy I didn't recognize walked toward me, stopped about 10 feet away and just stood there. He had his hands in his jacket pockets. He looked at me, then looked at the ground, then looked at me again. "You work at the hospital, right?" he said. I said, "Yeah." He took a step closer. "My name is Tomas. Marisol Becerra was my sister." I didn't say anything, I just looked at him. He was maybe 35, wiry, tired around the eyes, dark circles that looked permanent. He'd driven from El Paso 6 hours because he'd been trying to get Marisol's surgical records and the hospital kept telling him they were under review. "Under review," he said. His sentences came out short, bitten off. "For 2 years. Nobody can tell me what killed my sister, and the records are under review. For 2 years." He pulled out his phone and held it up. On the screen was a photo of Marisol, not the school photo, not the memorial one. A candid. She was in someone's kitchen, laughing, flour on her nose. She looked alive in that picture in a way that hit me in the chest. "That's her," he said. "That's who they won't give me answers about." I stood there in that gas station parking lot, and I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to hand him the notebook. I wanted to say, "I know, I've been watching, I have names and dates," but I didn't. I gave him my phone number and I said, "Call me next week." He looked at me for a long time. Then he nodded and drove away. That night I pulled the notebook out and counted. 6 names, 6 deaths, 4 years. And the brother of one of those 6 people had just found me at a gas station because nobody at the hospital would give him answers. I need to tell you what Warren Graf did when he found out Tomas had been asking questions, because it was the first time I saw who Warren really was. Tomas called me that Thursday. We met at a diner off Interstate 20 miles outside of Sweetwater. He'd been staying in a motel in Abilene. He told me he'd been calling the hospital every month for 2 years, requesting records, getting the same answer. "Administrative review, please be patient." He'd filed a complaint with the Texas Department of Health. It went nowhere. He'd hired a lawyer in El Paso who sent 2 letters.
The hospital's legal team responded with boilerplate, privacy regulations, standard review timelines. She was 28, Tomas said. She went in for an appendectomy. She was supposed to come home that afternoon.
I told him what I knew. Not all of it, not yet. But I told him about the pattern, the complication rate, the disappearing records. I told him about Corinne Vasquez getting fired. He set his coffee down and looked at me and said, "How many others?" I said, "At least 6. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Why hasn't anyone done anything?" And I didn't have an answer. I just sat there. Now, here's what I need to tell you. I initially thought the person covering this up was the chief of surgery. She had signed off on every one of Fenton's post-operative reports. Her name was on the complication reviews. Her signature approved the satisfactory ratings that kept Fenton operating. Tomas thought so too. We spent 3 weeks looking into her. I checked shift schedules, tried to figure out if she'd been in the building during the incidents. Tomas talked to a medical malpractice attorney in Dallas who said the chief of surgery would be the primary responsible party. It made sense. It all pointed to her. I also tried going through official channels. I called the county health department, got transferred once, twice, a third time, ended up with a woman who told me to fill out a Form 7C and mail it to a P.O. box in Austin. I asked what the turnaround time was. She said 8 to 12 weeks. I filled it out, mailed it, never heard back. Not a confirmation, not a rejection, nothing. The system had a slot for my complaint and it swallowed it whole. But then, I was going through some old shift logs I'd photocopied, looking for something else entirely, trying to match up staffing patterns with the incidents. And I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On 2 of the 6 death dates, the chief of surgery wasn't even in the building. She was at conferences. In one case, she was on vacation in Oregon. Her signature was on those reports, but she wasn't there. Someone had signed her name. And when I pulled the original sign-in logs for those dates, the handwritten ones at the front desk, the ones that never got digitized, the handwriting on her signature didn't match. It matched Warren Grath's. He'd been forging the chief of surgery's signature on complication reports. For years, the ground shifted under me. I'd been pointing in one direction for weeks, and the whole time it was the man behind the desk, the man with the warm handshake and the pressed shirt. The sickness in my gut wasn't fear. It was the realization that this was deeper and worse than anything I'd imagined. I sat in my truck outside that diner and I just laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so much worse than I thought. Think about that for a second. The man running the hospital, the man families trusted to oversee their care, was forging signatures to protect a surgeon who was killing patients. What would you do if you were sitting where I was, with those shift logs in your hands? Would you take it further, or would you walk? Tell me in the comments, because I almost walked. And what stopped me is what I'm about to tell you. 2 days after Tomas and I met at that diner, things started changing at the hospital. Graf reassigned me. After 19 years working the surgical wing, I was moved to outpatient services, the other side of the building. No reason given. My supervisor looked uncomfortable when she told me. She said, "It came from upstairs." I said, "From Graf?" She said, "I can't say, I'm sorry, Elias." That was Monday. On Wednesday, I found a formal written warning in my employee file. Failure to follow proper cleaning protocols in restricted areas. I had never received a warning in 19 years. Not one. On Friday, someone went through my locker. I keep it organized a certain way. Work shirts on the left, lunch bag on the right shelf, shoes on the bottom. When I opened it Friday afternoon, everything was moved. Not ransacked, just rearranged. Carefully examined and put back almost right. Almost. The notebook was in my truck, thank God. I called Tomas that night. I told him what was happening. He said, "They know you're asking questions." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Are you going to stop?" I almost said yes. I want to be honest about that. I sat on my back porch with the phone against my ear and I almost said yes. This isn't worth it. I can't lose my job. I can't lose my daughter's tuition benefit. I almost quit right there. But then Tomas said something I'll never forget. He said, "Marisol would have been 30 this month. She'd have been planning a birthday party for herself. She always did. She'd invite everyone she ever met. There's no party this year. There's no party ever again. And the man who did that to her is still operating. I didn't say anything for a long time. Then I said, "No, I'm not going to stop. If that moment hit you, hit subscribe. Because what I did next is what nearly destroyed me." I have to tell you about the moment I decided to go to the state medical board. Because up to this point, I've been watching, collecting, writing things down. But I hadn't actually done anything about it. The notebook was evidence of a pattern, but it was just an orderly's notes. Graf could call me paranoid. He could say I was a disgruntled employee. He could say anything. What I needed were the actual surgical logs, the originals, the ones Graf thought he'd destroyed. Here's the thing Graf didn't know. I'd been making photocopies. Not of everything. But starting in late 2017, every time I saw a surgical log get pulled for administrative review, I would go to the records room during the 48-hour window before it disappeared, and I would photocopy it. The records clerk, the nervous young woman, she let me use the copier because I told her I was making copies for the nursing staff. She didn't question it. Why would she? I was an orderly who'd been there 19 years. I was furniture. I had copies of 4 of the 6 surgical logs. Not the first 2. Those were pulled before I started copying. But I had the 43-year-old woman's, I had the rancher's, I had Rita's, and I had Marisol Becerra's. Marisol's log showed a surgical error, clear as day, a perforated artery during what should have been a 30-minute appendectomy. The note in the log said controlled, but the patient bled out on the table. And the version of events in the family notification letter said unforeseen cardiac event. 2 completely different stories. One for the file, one for the family. The morning after Tomas's phone call, I went to the records room to photocopy one more log, a recent complication I'd flagged. The door had a new lock on it, a keypad, the kind they install when someone decides to restrict access. I stood in front of that door for a full minute, staring at the blinking red light. The window was closing, because I was about to do something that would cost me my job, my health insurance, and nearly my safety. And I did it with a dollar store notebook and a stack of photocopies. October 2018, I made the decision. I drove to Austin on a Saturday, told my daughter I was visiting a friend in San Marcos. I didn't want to worry her. The Texas State Medical Board office is in a building off Congress Avenue, 4th floor, suite 417. I parked 3 blocks away because I was paranoid about my truck being recognized. Which is ridiculous. Austin is 4 hours from Sweetwater, but that's where my head was. I brought the notebook. I brought the 4 photocopied surgical logs. And I brought a typed timeline I'd put together on my home computer. Every incident, every date, every record that had disappeared. The intake investigator introduced herself as Investigator Lowell, mid-50s, reading glasses. She had this way of looking at you over the glasses that made you feel weighed and measured. Every sentence she spoke had a qualifier in it. Potentially, if substantiated, pending verification, precise, careful, the kind of person who doesn't waste words on things she can't prove. She listened. For 2 hours, she listened. She took notes. She asked questions that told me she understood exactly what I was describing. And when I showed her the discrepancy between Marisol's surgical log and the family notification letter, she put her pen down. She said, "Mr. Toomey, how long have you been collecting this?" I said, "About 1.5 years." She said, "And nobody at the hospital knows you have these copies?" I said, "No, ma'am." She looked at the surgical log for a long time. Then she said, "We're going to open a formal investigation. It's going to take time, months, maybe longer. During that time, you cannot tell anyone at the hospital what you've done. Can you do that?" I said I could. I asked about the timeline, how long before the subpoena could compel records. She said the hospital had 60 days to respond once it was served. After that, the board could escalate to a state court order. But filing, serving, and processing, that alone could take months. She said, "I need to be very clear with you. If what you're showing me is accurate, this is not a malpractice issue. This is a pattern of concealment tied to patient deaths. That's a different category entirely." She stood up and shook my hand, and I drove home. That was October 2018. The formal investigation wouldn't come to a head until December 2019, 14 months.
And during those 14 months, I went to work every day at Sweetwater Regional, mopped the floors, restocked the supplies, and looked Warren Graff in the eye every time he walked past me. He had no idea.
The hardest part was Tomas. I couldn't tell him about the medical board. Investigator Lowell had been explicit about that. So when Tomas would call me, frustrated, asking if anything was happening, I had to lie. I had to say, "I'm working on it, just be patient." And I could hear him losing hope on the other end of the phone. His sentences getting shorter, more silence between them. Some calls he barely spoke at all. Think about that for a second. 14 months of carrying this alone. 14 months of lying to the one person who trusted you, watching the clock, and waiting for a system to move at its own speed. Would you have been able to keep that secret? Would you have lasted 14 months without telling a soul? Tell me in the comments, because there were nights I almost broke, and the hearing date hadn't even been set yet. I need to tell you what started happening in the spring of 2019, because Warren Graff had figured out that someone was pulling at the threads of his hospital. He didn't know it was me, but he knew something was coming. The investigation moved slowly. Investigator Lowell contacted me 4 times between October 2018 and the summer of 2019. Each time by mail to a P.O. box I'd set up in Abilene so nothing came to my home address. She was careful. She told me the board had subpoenaed records from Sweetwater Regional. She told me the hospital's legal counsel was fighting the subpoena. The 60-day clock was ticking, and the hospital's lawyers were doing everything they could to stop it. Of course they were. In her 3rd letter, Lowell mentioned something that made me put the page down and stare at the wall. She said preliminary inquiries had flagged similar surgical outcome patterns at 2 other facilities where Fenton had previously held privileges. She used the phrase multi-facility concern, 3 words that turned this from one administrator's cover-up into something much larger. In March 2019, something happened that I didn't expect. Warren Graff approached me in the hallway. This was the first time he'd spoken to me directly since my reassignment a year earlier. He said, "Elias, you've been here a long time." I said, 19 years. He said, "That's a lot of loyalty. This hospital values loyalty." Then he put his hand on my shoulder. That same hand, that same grip that held a beat too long, and said, "I hear you've been talking to some people outside the hospital, family members, former employees." My stomach dropped. He said, "I understand the impulse. You're a compassionate person, but those conversations can be harmful to the hospital, to the families, to the grieving process. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is let people heal in peace." He smiled. Same warm smile he gave at memorial services. I said, "I understand, Mr. Graff." He said, "Good, because this hospital has been very good to you, Elias. 19 years of benefits, tuition coverage for your daughter. It would be a shame if any misunderstandings put that at risk." He patted my shoulder and walked away. I stood in that hallway for I don't know how long. A minute, 5 minutes. My hands weren't shaking. They were completely still, and that scared me more than the shaking would have. But I saw something in that moment. Just a flash, just before he turned. His eyes didn't match the smile. There was something behind them. Exhaustion. Not the kind from a long shift. The kind that comes from holding something together that wants to fall apart. A tremor in his jaw, he clenched away. Then it was gone and the performance came back. And he was Warren Graff again, walking down the hallway with his shoulders squared. He knew I'd been talking to Tomas. He didn't know about Austin, but he knew something. That night I noticed a truck I didn't recognize parked on my street. Dark blue Silverado, no front plate. It was there when I got home at 6 p.m. It was there when I took the trash out at 9. I checked the mirrors twice, pulling into my driveway. I noted the license plate in the notebook, or where the license plate should have been. Back plate was muddied over. I measured the distance between the truck and my house. 4 houses down. Close enough to watch, far enough to deny. It was gone by morning. It came back 3 nights later, same spot, same truck. I didn't call the police. In a town like Sweetwater, the police chief and the hospital administrator sit on the same Rotary Club board. I didn't trust anyone local. In June, I got a call from Investigator Lowell. She said the subpoena had been upheld by a state court. The hospital had 60 days to produce records. And she said something else.
2 former nurses from Sweetwater Regional had come forward independently with their own concerns about Fenton's surgical outcomes. One of them was Corinne Vasquez. Corinne, the nurse they'd fired for telling the truth.
I sat on my porch that night, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I don't know what to call it. Not hope, exactly. Just less alone. Here's what I've learned from 19 years of walking hospital hallways. The truth doesn't need you to be loud. It just needs you to not look away. The thing about fighting something by yourself is that after a while, you start to wonder if you're the one who's broken. If everybody else can go to work and not see what you see, maybe the pattern isn't there. Maybe the deaths were all coincidence and the records were all routine. And then someone else sees it too, and the wondering stops. The hearing date came in November, December 14th, 6 weeks away. And for the first time in 14 months, I could see the end of the hallway. December 14th, 2019. I laid out my clothes the night before. Gray slacks, the blue button-down my daughter gave me for Christmas 2 years ago. I ironed it twice. I drove the 4 hours to Austin in the dark, hands at 10 and 2, radio off, going exactly the speed limit the entire way. The Texas State Medical Board had scheduled its formal hearing on the complaint against Nils Fenton and Sweetwater Regional Medical Center. 14 months after I'd walked into that office with a dollar store notebook, I found out 3 weeks before the hearing. Investigator Lowell sent a certified letter to my P.O. box saying I'd be called as a material witness. She also told me the board had obtained records from 3 other hospitals where Fenton had previously worked, and there were similar patterns at 2 of them. 2 of them. This wasn't just Sweetwater. Fenton had been doing this before. And someone, maybe Graff, maybe someone before Graff, had been helping him move from hospital to hospital when things got too hot. I called Tomas that night. I finally told him everything. The medical board, the investigation, the hearing. He was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "You did this?" I said, "No. Your sister's surgical log did this. I just made sure it didn't disappear." The hearing was in Austin. Tomas drove up from El Paso. Corinne Vasquez drove from San Angelo. The hearing room was on the 2nd floor of the medical board building. Small, maybe 40 seats. Fluorescent lights that buzzed when the room went quiet. A long table at the front with 5 board members. Graff was there with 2 attorneys. Fenton was there, first time I'd seen him in a suit. He looked smaller, somehow. Thinner. His attorney kept leaning over to whisper something, and Fenton would nod without turning his head. One of the board members, an older man on the far left, took his glasses off and cleaned them 3 separate times during the opening statements. He never put them back on. And here's what Warren Graff didn't know. The 4 surgical logs I'd photocopied, the ones the hospital told the subpoena court had been lost during a records migration, they weren't the only copies. When Investigator Lowell had served the subpoena, she'd also sent a records preservation order to the hospital's electronic health records vendor, a third-party company in Houston. And that company, per their own retention policy, had maintained digital backups of every surgical log entered into their system going back to 2014. Graff had destroyed the paper copies. He'd altered the electronic versions in the hospital's local system, but he never thought about the vendor's backup servers. 7 complete surgical logs, unaltered, time-stamped. Every entry, every note, every outcome. The board's chief counsel presented them at 10:47 a.m. She laid 7 folders on the table, 1 for each patient death, and she read the discrepancies out loud. The original log entry, the altered version in the hospital system, the family notification letter, 3 different versions of what happened to Marisol Becerra. 3 different stories, all signed by Warren Graff. Sweetwater Regional won the Texas Rural Hospital Excellence Award in 2018. The same year Rita died on Fenton's table. The plaque was probably still hanging in the lobby while the board counsel read those 7 names. I was sitting in the 3rd row. My hands were on my knees, pressing down. I could see the back of Graff's head. When the counsel read Marisol's name, his right hand went to the table, just flat, pressing down, holding on. Fenton's attorney asked for a recess. The board denied it. Graff's attorney stood up and said,
Mr. Graff has dedicated 11 years of distinguished service to Sweetwater Regional. The testimony of a custodial employee with no medical training should not be the basis." The chief counsel cut him off. She turned to Graff and said, "Mr. Graff, can you explain why the surgical log filed with your hospital describes a cardiac event? The original log describes a perforated artery, and the backup log shows an entry modified 14 hours after the patient's time of death?" Graff looked at his attorneys. They looked at each other. Nobody said anything. Somewhere in the back of the room, someone's phone vibrated against the chair. The fluorescent light above the board table flickered once. 14 hours. He'd waited 14 hours after Marisol died, then logged into the system and changed the cause of death. And he thought nobody would ever see the timestamp. Records don't forget. The hearing lasted 2 days. Fenton's medical license was suspended pending a full review. Graff was referred to the Texas Attorney General's office for potential criminal charges: falsification of medical records, obstruction, and accessory after the fact in multiple wrongful deaths. Tomas was sitting next to me when the suspension was read. He didn't move. He didn't make a sound. He just sat there with his hands in his lap, very still. After it was over, I walked out of the building into the December air. The sky was white, flat, no wind. I made it to a bench outside and my legs gave. I sat down and my hands started shaking, and I couldn't make them stop. My vision went blurry at the edges. I pressed my palms flat on the cold metal of the bench and focused on the temperature. The cold going into my skin, something real, something solid. Corinne found me there 10 minutes later. She sat down next to me and didn't say a word. We just sat there. Two people who'd been inside that hospital, who'd seen what was happening, who'd been punished for noticing. A sound came out of me. Not quite a laugh, not quite anything. And she looked at me and said, "Yeah, that was it. Yeah, and that was enough." The aftermath came in waves. The first wave was institutional. Within a week of the hearing, the Texas Attorney General's office opened a formal criminal investigation into Warren Graff. His administrative privileges at Sweetwater Regional were suspended immediately. 2 weeks later, the hospital board, which had apparently been kept in the dark about the records manipulation, terminated Graff's employment. 11 years as administrator. Done. Fenton's license was permanently revoked in February 2020, after the full review confirmed a pattern of substandard surgical care across 3 hospitals spanning 9 years. 9 years. The board found 14 patients across 3 facilities who had died following procedures where Fenton's surgical decisions deviated significantly from standard practice. 14 people. When that number came out, I went home and I sat in my kitchen and I looked at my notebook. I had 6 names. There were 8 more I didn't know about. 8 families in other towns who went through what Marisol's family went through. The same unanswered questions. The same under-review letters. The same silence. I put the notebook in the drawer, and I couldn't close the drawer. I just stood there with my hand on it. Then I walked to the bathroom, and I turned on the shower, and I sat on the floor of the tub with the water running, and I stayed there until the hot water ran out. I don't know how long that was. 20 minutes? 30? Long enough for the water to go cold, and for me to still not move. Graff was indicted in March 2020 on 12 counts of falsifying medical records and 4 counts of obstruction. His trial was delayed by COVID and didn't happen until September 2021. He was convicted on 9 counts, sentenced to 7 years. I wasn't at the sentencing. By then, I'd made my peace with it. But Tomas was there. He called me afterward. He said Graff stood at the defense table when the sentence was read, and he didn't look at anyone, just stared straight ahead. Tomas said, "I wanted him to look at me. I wanted him to see Marisol's brother sitting in that courtroom, but he never turned around." I lost my job, of course. Not officially. They didn't fire me for whistleblowing. What they did was eliminate my position in a restructuring 2 months after the hearing. I got a severance package, 90 days of health insurance continuation, no tuition benefit for my daughter's last year of college. That part hurt. I'm not going to pretend it didn't. 19 years, And at the end, they found a way to make it feel like I'd done something wrong. But here's what happened that I didn't expect. Corinne Vasquez filed a wrongful termination lawsuit against the hospital. She won. The settlement was confidential, but she called me the day it was finalized and she sounded not happy, just solid. Something that had been off balance was standing straight again.
And the Becerra family, along with 4 other families, filed a civil suit against the hospital and against Graf personally. The suit is still ongoing. But Tomas told me their attorneys said the medical board's findings made the case extremely strong. I got a new job, night shift, at a warehouse distribution center in Abilene. 45-minute drive each way. The pay isn't great, but nobody's dying on the floor, and nobody's hiding the records when they do. I see Tomas every couple of months. He drives up from El Paso and we eat at a barbecue place off the highway. We don't always talk about Marisol. Sometimes we talk about football. Sometimes we don't talk much at all. The last time I saw him, he showed me a photo on his phone. Marisol's 3rd grade class from her last year of teaching. 22 kids standing in front of Southeast Elementary. Marisol in the middle, both arms out wide, the biggest smile. He said, "They planted a tree for her at the school. The kids from that class are in 8th grade now. They still take care of it." I looked at that photo for a long time. She would have been 32. It's been a little over 2 years since the hearing. I'm sitting in my apartment in Abilene right now telling you this, and I'm still not sure I did the right thing at the right time. I think about the 2 years I waited. 2017 to 2018. 2 years of watching and writing in a notebook and not doing anything. Rita died during those 2 years. Maybe others, I don't know. That's the part I carry. But I also think about what would have happened if I'd gone to the medical board without the copies, without the timeline, without the pattern laid out clearly enough for Investigator Lowell to see it immediately. Graf's lawyers would have called me a disgruntled former employee, and they would have won. I want to say something to you before I finish. You've been listening to me for a while now, and I appreciate that more than you know. This isn't an easy story to tell. Parts of it I've never said out loud before tonight. And the fact that you stayed, that you're still here, that matters to me. It really does. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever seen something wrong and had to decide whether to speak up, I'm asking you to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Not for me, for the next person who needs to know they're not alone. And if you've got a story of your own, something you saw, something you carried, leave it in the comments. I'll read every one of them. There's more stories like this on the channel. Real ones, hard ones. I hope you'll stick around for them. You know what I learned? The people who bury the truth aren't afraid of the truth itself. They're afraid of the person who won't stop asking for it. Tomas sent me a text last week. He said the tree at Southeast Elementary is taller than the fence now. He sent a picture. I saved it. I'm looking at a letter on my kitchen counter right now. It arrived yesterday from the Texas Health and Human Services Commission. They're starting a review of rural hospital oversight procedures. They want to know if I'd be willing to consult. I haven't opened it yet. It's still sealed. I keep picking it up and putting it back down. My hand is on it right now.